This episode of The Five Things is the everybody shut up issue. So I don't know if Gary just woke up on the wrong side of the bed or he'll have to give us a little bit more context about that. So,
It was
uh,
it was a combination of people in Washington saying stupid things and me
yeah,
just
all
being a
right.
little cranky, and sometimes that's the title. What can you do?
I love it. Thing number one this week, Gary, we've got the Fed moves from hawkish pause to dovish pause. Tell us more about that.
So the Federal Reserve meets, I think it's 10 times a year. They have 2-day meetings, and at the end of those 2 days of meetings, they issue a press release, and then shortly after that, Chairman Jerome Powell will give a press conference where he reads a prepared statement and then tries to not look annoyed while every single reporter in the room asks him 27 versions of the same question, which is, when are you going to lower rates? And he says, well, we're data driven. We don't know. It's not today. And, they keep trying to pin him down. And at some point, he just looks so annoyed with the entire room, which, in fairness to Powell, I would look annoyed too if 27 people all asked me 27 versions of the same question. So the press release came out, and as expected, the Fed kept the Fed funds rate, interest rates the same. There was no change. That's pretty much what everybody knew would happen. And my read on the statement was it was slightly more hawkish than it had been the prior month. Now, but for people who are not so familiar with finance speak or economic speak, hawkish means favoring higher interest rates. Dovish means favoring lower interest rates. And last month, the language the committee had used was ambiguous regarding where they were in the economy. This time, there was no ambiguity. They reiterated, I'm quoting from the press release, that they're strongly committed to returning inflation to its 2% objective, and then admitted there'd been a lack of progress in recent months toward getting there. That is pretty clear, saying, hey, the economy's running hot. We're not getting there on inflation. No way are we touching interest rates. That's a pretty hawkish message. And yet, the market responded in the opposite direction. You would expect a hawkish message to take stock prices down, and that's not what happened. By the next day, stock prices were skyrocketing, and that was different from what anybody would have expected.
Gary, you talk a little bit in the takeaway about quantitative tightening, QT. Why did the market react positively the way it did with the intention to start to taper that quantitative tightening?
That's the key question, Rob. So first, let's explain to people what quantitative easing and quantitative tightening are. Historically, if we go back a few decades, the one policy tool the Federal Reserve had and used was changing the Fed funds rate. And it's kind of a blunt tool, but pretty effective in getting inflation under control or trying to help expand the economy. Um, a number of years ago, they discovered this great power of quantitative easing and quantitative tightening. And that simply means using the Federal Reserve balance sheet to add liquidity to the system. So in quantitative easing, the Fed basically issues bonds, buys the bonds back, stores the bonds on its balance sheet. But when it buys those bonds, it puts liquidity into the system. They put dollars in the hands of banks and other market participants, and that does make its way through the economy. Now, the issue is the Federal Reserve during COVID blew up a $9 trillion balance sheet. For people who aren't familiar with those numbers, it is obscene. If we go pre 2008, before that financial crisis, I think the Fed balance sheet was somewhere around $1 trillion. They do need a certain amount of liquidity in the system to deal with money flows one way or another. 9 trillion is obscene. And so when they decided that they wanted to start addressing inflation, they started to reverse what they'd been doing. And what that means is they were letting those bonds roll off. And when that happened, money came in to pay the Fed for the bonds that they had sold before. And so as that happened, the Federal Reserve balance sheet was declining by a little bit every month. The thing is, a little bit every month for a year and a half, and you pretty quickly get to the point where you've taken $1 trillion, $2 trillion off the total. It was a meaningful number. So the Federal Reserve press release, in this case, I'm grabbing the numbers here, they announced an intention to start to taper quantitative tightening. And what that means is they're going to keep letting the bonds roll off the balance sheet. They're going to keep engaging in quantitative tightening to reduce the size of the Federal Reserve balance sheet, but they're going to do it more slowly. And the big change is the monthly net redemptions on Treasury securities are being cut from 60 billion a month to 25 billion a month. That's a difference of 35 billion a month times 12. That slows quantitative tightening by $420 billion a year. That's a big number. And so the market said, aha, the Fed, they're not back at quantitative easing, but they're reducing their tightening by almost $500 billion a year. That's a meaningful number. And once the market figured that out, went straight up.
Gotcha. Thanks for breaking that down, Gary.